Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
We are just 1 week away from Beyond the Grave for this year, so I'm so excited.
And the weather's going to be perfect. It has
I
to
know,
be.
it is. It's going to be not hot, not cold, not rainy, none of those things. But we have the perfect cast this year. Well, we've had the perfect cast every year, and actually several of our cast members this year are returning. They've all done this before, except for two, I think. Yeah, two of our cast members, but they've actually attended the event in the past. So they're familiar with the whole concept of it, which is great. And they are just phenomenal. So for those of you that are coming, you are in for a real treat. I know we say this every year, but we're also super proud of this event. So
we are. And then because 2 weeks ago, you came down and we worked through the route of the cemetery in circles many times, because we always try to go to different areas of the cemetery, because the cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery, is over 200 acres, and it's such a beautiful cemetery that we want people to be able to see all the parts of it. So it's a different route, and we're so excited.
Yeah, I think there's only one stop this year that was the same as last year. And it's at a different timing. Like last year, it was towards the beginning of the ride. This year, it's at the end.
Yes.
But all the other stops are new sections that we haven't been able to feature yet. And part of the fun for us, though, when we do it, is when we know we're telling a certain story, we try and find locations that kind of go with the theme of the story, or that we feel the actors can use as part of what they're talking about.
Almost like a stage. It's almost like certain areas are like stages. So it's really cool.
Yeah, it's great. And so this year we're super excited about a couple of the places that we chose based on what the actors are going to be doing. And then, in the past years, for those who've attended, we've had the vignettes with the high school students that are in between our adult actors. This year, those high school students are actually working directly with our adult actors.
That's really cool.
To enhance the scenes even more. So it's going to be really, really fun. And we're definitely looking forward to it. And actually, some of our high school students aren't even high school students this year. A couple of them were seniors last year. They graduated, but they're still in the area and they wanted to come back. So
awesome. That's so cool.
I know. I'm super excited to have those kiddos back, because they've been great every year. We love being able to work with our high schoolers and introduce them to the literature and the cemetery and all the fun stuff. So I'm glad we're back. So in anticipation of our event, we have brought a very special guest on to join us today. His name is Jared Richman. He is a professor at Colorado College, and he specifically teaches in the English department about classic literature. He does a whole class on Frankenstein and Mary Shelley and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. And so we wanted to bring Jared on to talk about Mary Shelley specifically. As I told him, I've been girl crushing on both her and Mary Wollstonecraft all summer, because I was taking so much time to learn about them, and they are absolutely fascinating women. It's so funny, when we chose Frankenstein last year, one of the reasons we picked it is not only because it's a classic, but because it was a woman author, and we haven't featured any female authors yet. So we wanted to feature that. And I personally didn't know that much about Mary Shelley at the time, other than she was the author of Frankenstein. And I knew she had written some other stuff, but I hadn't really read much of it. And now I can't get enough of her and her writing. So Jared, welcome to the show.
Yeah. Hi. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
And now you said you'll be teaching this course soon. That's coming up.
Yeah, I'm teaching Frankenstein in 2 weeks, probably.
I love it. So your students are in for a real treat. I hope I loved the book. I was told by my oldest daughter, actually, who while she was at school, she took a course on monsters in literature. So it included Frankenstein, it included Dracula, it included a lot of the stuff we've actually already done. She's like, "You're like Frankenstein better than Dracula, Mom." And I was like, I don't know, because I've always been a huge fan of the book Dracula. So, but I think she was right.
I did actually was good and actually read the book this time, and I could not put it down. It is incredible. And to think the age that Mary Shelley wrote this, and just the time period, that's even more, to me, mind-blowing. So I can't wait to hear more about her.
So we're going to have Jared, before we get too in-depth in our discussion, get off course here. Why don't you give us like a brief synopsis of Mary Shelley, her who she was, kind of her life. And like I said, I've mentioned her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, a couple of times, and why that's so important to Mary Shelley. So let's start with that, and then we'll kind of go from there with our discussion.
I'm sure. I mean, it's going to be hard for because there's so much I want to say about Mary Shelley and her life and her really fascinating works. And she's, arguably she's best known as the author of Frankenstein, or it has a subtitle, or The Modern Prometheus. She was actually the author of 7 novels, and she also was an editor of her late husband's work. She was also author of some memoirs about her travels all throughout Europe. But she's also known because she has 2 very famous parents. Her father's name is William Godwin, who was a journalist and a novelist and a philosopher and a political radical in the late 18th century. And he also owned a bookshop where Mary Shelley, and at that time Mary Godwin, grew up. And then her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft, arguably one of the most famous women of the 18th century. She was, or I should say, she is the sort of mother of the modern feminist movement and the author of probably the earliest codified feminist treatise in English called The Vindications of the Rights of Woman, which came out in 1792. And so Mary Shelley had 2 really famous parents who were both writers, both novelists, both radicals, political radicals. And that was kind of the genesis of her beginning. And so Shelley herself was born Mary Shelley. She goes by, early on, she's known as Mary Godwin because that's her father's name, but then she takes on her mother's name when she becomes an author. So she starts to refer to herself as Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, MWS. And her then future husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, PBS,
I love his initials.
Yeah, I know that it's so great. There's a lot of initials in this. So she's born in 1797 to her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft dies 11 days after Mary is born from complications from the birth itself, which weirdly might have a connection to the grave itself, which is to say the physicians of the time were not well versed in cleanliness and hygiene. And the physician who assisted with the birth, after Mary was born, he went to clear out the placenta, and we think he didn't have washed hands, and maybe transmitted an illness to Mary Wollstonecraft. And this is, there's no way of knowing this, but oftentimes physicians in this period they would have a range of different patients, and they would move from kind of different procedures, one of them being autopsies. And this particular physician may have been performing autopsies and then moving from working with those bodies then to women who were giving birth. So there is a kind of connection there. It's perhaps anecdotal, but so when Mary is born, her mother dies 11 days later, and then never knows her mother, at least not in a physical way. And so her father, William Godwin, who was deeply in love with his wife, was crushed by her loss and sort of turns to his work as a writer and the owner of a bookshop in central London. Wollstonecraft is buried in St. Pancras churchyard. And when Mary is a child, her father will often take her there to visit her mother's grave. And so Mary is known to spend a lot of time at her mother's grave, especially after William Godwin, her father, remarries in I think it's 1801, to a woman named Jane. I'm sorry, Mary Jane Claremont. And sort of young Mary Godwin and her stepmother don't really get along, so she spends a lot of time outside of the house, and she hangs out a lot in the cemetery where her mom is buried, and she takes her mother's writings when she's there. Her mother's novels. Mary, Wollstonecraft was the author of 2 novels and a lot of short fiction. Her first novel is called Mary, a Fiction, and then she was her last novel was incomplete, but her eventually published. It's called Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, and they're both sort of, I would say, like, they're both philosophical novels, proto-feminist novels. And then young Mary often reads her mother's feminist treatises, the Vindications, and she's known to lie on her mother's grave and read her mother's works as a way of connecting to her dead mother. When she's around, I think around 15 or so, she meets Percy Bysshe Shelley, who will be her future husband. That's in 1812. And Shelley he's an iconoclast, he's a radical, he's an anarchist. He shares these radical philosophies with her father, William Godwin. He goes and he seeks out Godwin. He's this young guy, he's a radical in his early 20s. He's like, I got to meet the other sort of major radical of the period. And he goes and he finds Godwin. And then of course, he meets Shelley. Mary Godwin. Excuse me. It's hard. All the names change a lot, so I kind of have to remember kind of where I am in time. At this time, Percy Shelley is actually married to a woman named Harriet Westbrook. They're married and they have a young child. Percy, when he spends a lot of time with the Godwin family, he begins to spend a lot of time with Mary as well, and they take walks in St. Pancras churchyard, and they walk around where her mother is buried. It's said that he falls in love with her there, and she falls in love with him, even though he has a wife and a young child. I don't know if I can say this on the podcast, but we have a lot of evidence that they may have Percy and Mary may have how do I say this? Consummated their relationship.
That's a good way to put it.
Intimate relationship.
In the graveyard where her mother is buried. Which,
makes sense. It's private. I mean, they had privacy. How old was Percy?
They did have privacy. That's a good point.
Percy was a few years older than Mary. Yeah.
Yeah, he's about 6 years older than Mary is.
Yeah.
So when they start to have this relationship, Mary's just shy of I think she's around 16, and Percy is in his early 20s, maybe 22 or so. So, it's an interesting relationship at the start, and they fall in love, and then Shelley goes to see William Godwin and asks for his blessing in running away with Mary, his daughter Mary, which is quite shocking to everyone. But they elope, and they leave England in 1816. I'm sorry, 1814. Excuse me. In 1814, and they also have with them, Mary's stepsister, who's known as Claire Claremont. And eventually they meet up with Lord Byron, the infamous Lord Byron, who's a friend of Shelley's, and they spend a summer in Geneva, Lake Geneva specifically, with Byron and his doctor, John Polidori. And this is the summer, sort of this like famous summer where the weather was really horrible.
Yeah. It was a cold summer. It was like really winter cold weather almost.
Yeah, caused, they think, by a volcano that had spread ash into the air and then created this sort of overcast summer. So they had to spend a lot of time inside. And then famously one night they decide to have a contest where all of the folks there, Percy and Mary and Byron and Polidori, decide to tell each other ghost stories, and they each conceive of a ghost story. And Mary, who's around 16, comes up with Frankenstein. It's when she conceives of the idea of Frankenstein. Byron comes up with a tale that eventually becomes a poem called Manfred, and John Polidori comes up with this a work. It's an early vampire tale, actually, she bases on Byron, so it's a very sexy vampire tale. Uh,
And that's probably where we get the idea of sexy vampires to begin
all
with.
vampire tales are sexy.
no, it is,
Weird.
and you actually know that Bram Stoker actually drew a lot of his inspiration from what
Yes.
this eventual publication, because Byron is a lord and he's kind of a sexually omnivorous fellow, and so that ends up getting kind of wrapped up into the kind of Dracula mythology that Stoker catalyzes in his work. But Mary, it's where she conceives of Frankenstein, and then she works on it for about a year, and she ends up finishing it in 1817, and then it gets published in 1818. But you got to remember, like, she's super young when
Yes.
she writes this. And not only is she young, but the whole time that she's writing and revising and working on Frankenstein, she's either pregnant or nursing or recovering from a miscarriage. So there's all these sort of issues around motherhood and the body that are kind of bound up in when she's writing this piece.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the first things after I read it. I mean, I knew she was young when she wrote it. But by the time I finished reading the book, my mind was so blown away by some of the concepts that she puts into the story. And now, granted, the version I read was the 1831 republication. So I know there had been a few changes that she had made from the time she first published it to the time it came out again in 1831, including the fact that her name was actually on it in 1831, where when she published it the first time, they did not include her name because she was a woman. And the fascinating thing to me is when people first started reading it, they liked the idea of the story, but once they found out it was conceived by a woman, they were like, wait, these are not thoughts women are supposed to be having. Like, the whole concept of creating a body and lightning and the whole thing. As I was reading more into the history behind it, I was kind of like, okay. And I know in a modern sense, women think all kinds of things and it's not a thing. But for her, when people were like, why would a woman even think these things? And why would she have an interest in Darwin? And, all of those things that kind of played into her creating that story was fascinating to me. And just the reception that it got once they discovered it was a woman who wrote the story and not a man.
And there were claims that she didn't write it, that it was actually Percy. Now he did edit it and he did work on it with her. And we have these manuscripts, these wonderful manuscripts, where we can see that they're actually working on it together in some places. But the ideas are hers and the story is hers. And likewise, after Percy dies in 1822, she becomes his editor and edits his work, and leads to the sort of posthumous publications of his poetry and his writing. So they really did have a wonderful collaboration as writers and as intellectuals, but they're both incredibly young. I mean, Percy dies when he's 29. Like Mary is, I always tell my college students, she's your age when she writes Frankenstein.
She is.
No pressure, but she's a college student. So it's this remarkable thing. And then, there's 3 editions of Frankenstein. The first is 1818. It's published in January of 1818, and it is published, as Jenny said, it's anonymous. And then there's a second edition that is published in 1823, that there really aren't any major changes, but then there are some changes in the 1831. That's the third and final edition of the book, but it was quite popular. It was made into a play that was staged with a figure of the creature. It was really, really popular, actually. And then eventually it has this afterlife where it becomes, it's made into films and TV shows and all of these adaptations. And so, and they haven't stopped. There was a film that came out last year called Lisa Frankenstein, which is quite good, I thought, actually.
Did you watch it? I hadn't watched it yet. I didn't want to be influenced by it to do what we were doing yet. So I was waiting until we did this.
Oh, God. No, it's great. It's great.
Oh.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, since there have been so many adaptations, which one has been your favorite?
I'm going to say this and everyone's going to judge me, but honestly, I mean, so I'll go with films because there's been a lot of literary adaptations, and I
Yeah,
like
the
a lot of those
films
too.
or TV specials or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah, that stuff.
I mean, I have a soft spot for the first sort of major feature film that was 1731, the director John Wales version that really establishes what the creature looks like and what he sounds like, and it's got the iconic, it's alive, that whole thing. Just and that becomes like this. It's all well, it'd be like a meme now, right? But
Right.
I think my favorite, honestly, is Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein. It's
I
so
love that
good.
movie.
So good. It's so good because not only is it really, really funny, but it's in its own way super true to, I think, Shelley's original novel. And I just honestly, I can't get enough of it. I still think it's so smart. It's so great. It's so great.
I'll have to
And
watch it again.
it's so great. Peter Boyle as the creature, and Gene Wilder is like the grandson of
Yes.
Victor Frankenstein.
Frankenstein, not Frankenstein.
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 Cary Garr is in it, and the amazing like Madeline Kahn is just sublime. It's so great. It's
It
so
is
great.
such a good. I know my husband kept trying to. Are you going to repeat any lines? Are you going to do? He's like, "Are you going to work it in?" And I was like,
Hey, I'm here for that.
I was like trying to figure out if there was a way to work in even one of the iconic lines from the movie, because it is, like you said, it is such a good one. And after I read the book, and then I had seen that movie many times before, but I was like, "Yep, that is." Even though there's a twist on it and it's funny and it's whatever, they really did a good job of sticking to some of Mary Shelley's original themes for the story itself, which I love about that movie. And you're right, it's so good.
No, I
It
gotta
is a
watch
classic.
Yeah, there was one that came out. When was that one? I was trying to tell you to.
We
Was
said it was
the
in the
90s?
90s. I think we said early 90s.
Yeah, and for the life of me, I can't think what it's called now, but I had Helen Bonham Carter in it, and I enjoyed
Oh,
it
it's
because
called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein,
yeah,
actually.
okay,
Yeah.
that's what it was.
Yeah,
And
it's
I liked it
what's
because the monster was not a monster like the typical, Frankenstein. He was very a man, but he had the
yeah.
scar. Yeah, I really liked that one because
It's
I thought
I
it
mean,
was
it's got all these stars in it. It's Kenneth Branagh plays
Yes.
Victor, and yeah, and Helena Bonham Carter plays Elizabeth. And Diane, do you remember who plays the creature? Do you remember?
no.
It's Robert De Niro.
Oh, so yeah, I gotta watch
So
that one again.
bizarre. And I worked with this guy. So my doctoral advisor is a great Frankenstein scholar, a great Shelley scholar. And he used to say about that film that it was awful because uh, Robert De Niro, his face looks like a baseball because it has a very prominent sort of,
Star.
string on one side. It's just, you just see it and you think like, oh my God, I can't believe
No,
this.
I won't be able to watch that. I'll just see a baseball.
I'm
I don't think I
sorry.
realized that was Robert De Niro, but I haven't seen that version of it. So I was
Yeah.
like, I didn't realize
It's not his best role.
Oh,
he is not the person you would think of when
no,
casting
Frankenstein.
any kind
Yeah.
of classic horror show movie, but whatever.
Know what to say.
It was like a favor or something.
It
Yeah.
could have been.
But I think it's one of my favorite aspects of the kind of evolution of the novel of Frankenstein and the creature, and is because, and I have a real interest in this, just on my own. A lot of my work is not just on Gothic literature and culture and stuff, but I'm really interested in disability, and I've written a lot about this, and in the novel, and my students are always really surprised by this, but there's Victor, he tells his story and he's a scientist, whatever. But then the creature, he tells his story and he's extremely eloquent.
Yes.
He's
Mhm.
really great at that's the whole thing. And then because we always think about the 1931, excuse me, film, right, by John Whale, which is like, the creature, if he says anything, it's kind of
Mhm.
grunting. He's like, bread. Like he
Yeah,
doesn't,
he grunts and
he's
groans and
almost a mute, right? But one of the defining features of Mary Shelley's creature is that he's really eloquent. Like and that's how he convinces all of the characters in the novel to do things. And, he has these long dialogues with Victor about, his creation and stuff. So that's a major change when it shifts from the novel and then the stage and then eventually into film. So yeah,
I think that was one of the things when it shifted to the stage. I know Mary Shelley went and saw it a couple of times, but I think she was disappointed that they didn't make the creature more eloquent the way she did. And that was one of the things I loved about the book, is that you got Victor Frankenstein's perspective on being this creator of this creature, but then you get his perspective as the creature and everything that he went through, and it makes you feel really sorry for both characters. But it's really hard. There's not like, this is a story, and I was discussing this with another director friend of mine. In the book, there is not like a bad guy, good guy, because the way she wrote the characters, all of the characters, but especially Victor and the monster, there's a lot of complication for both of them. And so you can see those perspectives. And she, again, 18, 19 years old, when she's putting this story together and putting those thoughts of creation like that. But like you said, a lot of it has to do with the fact that she was a first-time mom at this point, and she'd gone through a miscarriage. And so she was dealing with the idea of creation on a different level, but still those thoughts were there. And you can see that reflected back in both characters. And it was very important to me for our event that when I was writing our script, that we have the monster and his complexity as part of the story. And so,
yeah, the people aren't familiar with the novel, they would not know. Probably most people are familiar with the 1931 version, and Fred, is it Fred Munster?
Oh,
yep. Fred from the Munsters.
Munsters. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So that's all, most people, that's all they've ever known.
Yeah. I mean, and it has become the kind of dominant.
Herman, damn it.
Herman
Fred Gwynne, Herman Munster. So,
and then there's also, I always point out, I teach courses on comics too, but the Hulk, the Incredible Hulk, is actually a kind of and and then of course, there's all of those movies, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Like, there's so many of these things, and he's always depicted as this kind of hulking, like, grunting figure that doesn't really articulate his words. And I think that's a nice thing to kind of reinsert that. And I think, honestly, Jenny, that point is so compelling that we actually do get the creature's own story, right? He tells his story. And in fact, that's something that he demands of Victor. Like, he has two demands, right? When he meets them inside the novel. Can we talk about the novel? Is that okay if we do that?
Yeah.
Inside the novel, when he like first after the creation scene, and then Victor runs away, and then the creature runs away. They meet up again on the top of Mont Blanc, right in the Alps, and Victor sort of like, he sees him and he calls him the first thing he says is devil, right? And then of course the creature says, I expected his reception. Like, he just knew that was gonna, because he'd already been experiencing rejection. But he asks him for two things, right? He says to Victor, hear my story. He says, listen to my tale. He says that many, many times, and that gets over and over in the novel. And then eventually his other request is to make him a companion, right? But the really interesting aspect is that he just wants someone to listen to him. He wants to be able to. And I think, Jenny, you said like that it's, when you read the novel, it's hard not to sympathize with the creature, right? But we always imagine he's this horrible, scary figure, but really he's so compelling. And at the end of, when I teach this novel, I always ask my students at the end of our discussion, at the end of the novel, who is the real monster? And they really don't know. They like debate this for a while, because is it Victor? Is it the creature? There's so many, it's hard to know. It just is.
Yeah, that's the thing so when I was putting our script together, I was like, I really want the monster to tell his story like he does in the book. So we do that. And the other thing that you realize is he wants to be heard, but he just wants to be loved. He wants to be part of humanity, and he just can't because of the way he looks. That those physical attributes that he has because of the way he was created keep him separate from humanity, which on so many levels, when we even come into a modern age, we still have those issues in society where if somebody, and like you said, you study disabilities and stuff, but when somebody has a disability of some kind, especially if it's a physical one that people can see, it makes them through no fault of their own, but it makes them less approachable by a lot of people. And people treat them so much differently rather than just stopping and giving them a chance. And so many people throughout his course in the novel, every time he appears in a group of people, they freak out because they look at this thing going, what in the world? And then they all run and they beat him up, and all these horrible things happen. You can understand why he becomes a little bit murderous later
Well, this
on.
is the thing, and I think I think you really hit on the reason why his novel has endured and why it's still so popular and relevant, and it gets all of these adaptations. I mean, it's the first of its kind for many reasons, right? Like it's one of the earliest science fiction novels. It's a novel that also I'm interested in like genre and stuff, but it has a really interesting like form. It's what we call epistolary, right? It's written as letters, right?
Yeah.
Kind of interesting, and that's at the end of the sort of age of epistolary fiction. It's written about it's sort of within what we call the Gothic tradition of English literature. It's the first novel of Mary Shelley, who's the daughter of, of like Godwin and Wollstonecraft, like, and it's a feminist novel. And I think the most interesting readings of Frankenstein have been by feminist critics, and it just does so much. But as you said, it's also about, I've had so many discussions about it. There's anxiety about humans reaching too far in terms of technology and science. It,
Mm-hmm.
it's about changing the nature of life. It's about acting as gods. I mean, there's so many of these questions. And it's also about what does it mean to be different, and how does one, fit into a society? And these are central questions. My students, I often say, like, at its heart, it's a novel that sort of asks a question, is sort of what does it mean to be human? And I'm not sure it's able to offer answers, but it sure asks a whole lot of questions.
Right. It makes you think. Well, and you just meant something else you just said, it talks about how do you fit into society, which Mary Shelley struggled with that her whole
Yeah.
life. And her mom did too, because, she technically, if Godwin hadn't married Mary Wollstonecraft, she would have been born illegitimately. She did have an older sister who was illegitimate because Mary Wollstonecraft, marriage in itself as an institution was not important to her. And it wasn't initially important to Godwin, although I feel like he changes his mind about that by the time Mary's older. and it goes back and forth, which I think is what shocked her when she and Percy were running away together, that her dad was so kind of
Okay
against
with
the
it.
whole reunion because
Oh,
it
yeah.
didn't go with what he had written about in his earlier writings and talked about. And
I mean, it's sort of fraught. I mean, Wollstonecraft is writing sorry, Mary's mother is writing at a time where there were very, very prescribed roles for women, right? And as you
mm-hmm.
said earlier, it was very hard to be a female author, and there were terrible diatribes against women who dared to step out into the public and write something and show that they had brains and that they had education. And well, Wollstonecraft was fearless. I mean, she really was. She started her writing career in the late 1780s. She began publishing, and she began her sort of life uh, as a tutor and a teacher and a governess. And so she'd had these experiences of educating women and early on, and then she just had these thoughts. And when she met Godwin, it was like this sort of perfect storm of this intellectual excitement in London in the early 1790s. Remember, this is kind of in the shadow of the French Revolution, which breaks
Mm-hmm.
out in 1789, and we're not too far after the American Revolution. And so the kind of the old institutions are being challenged, right? Politically,
Mm-hmm.
socially, in terms of religion. And, Godwin is an anarchist, essentially, which doesn't mean he's for chaos, but rather he's very suspicious of organized, especially of monarchies and
An
those
organized religion.
yeah, organized religion. And the French Revolution swept away most of that in France. And so the English were super excited about this. So Godwin, he meets Mary Wollstonecraft in London. And there's a whole group of other intellectuals there. Joseph Johnson, who was a publisher, he was like he used to have these salons and dinners at his house. He would have all of these really interesting
Imagine.
people who would be there. William Blake, the poet, was kind of an ancillary figure. He was an iconoclast and radical. John Thelwell, who's a radical orator. Thomas Holcroft, who's a radical and dramatist. He's put on trial in 1794 for treason, and Godwin goes to support him. There's just a lot of sort of political unrest in London in the 1790s, and that's when Godwin and Wollstonecraft kind of get together and they have a relationship. And we have Godwin's diary of that period, and for years he had this really weird kind of shorthand and notation, and no one could figure it out. And then they eventually cracked the code, and they realized that one of the codes where he marked every time that he and Wollstonecraft had sex.
Yep.
So there was that was in the journal, but it's true. They were both sort of against marriage in the traditional way, especially because it oppressed women. And so they really only got married under they were, I think one of Godwin's biographers says that they were both embarrassed to discover that Mary was pregnant with Mary Godwin. And so they got married, I think, in order to just make it easier to not have the social stigma, right, of being unmarried.
For their daughter. Yeah.
But Mary Wollstonecraft had gone through, she'd had some very high profile affairs, we can call them, right?
Yep.
She was with this guy named Gilbert Imlay, who was a American officer. He had a military title, but he was more like a mercenary, and he had kind of business dealings in the Americas and in France and in the US. And he fathered a child with Mary Wollstonecraft, Fanny Imlay. And then he just abandoned them, basically. And so Wollstonecraft was on her own early on. She also had a very high profile relationship with a Swiss painter named Henri Fuseli, who's known for actually painting one of the most disturbing but iconic paintings. It's called The Nightmare. It's this woman who's lying on a bed, prone, and there's this little demon sitting on her chest. Yep. It's really wonderful. So she had a lot of interesting relationships even before she met Godwin, and was already sort of cutting across the kind of a social grain of the era. So, but by the time she met William Godwin, you have these two just remarkably intelligent people who were advancing incredibly progressive ideas. And then they have this daughter, in 1797, who goes on to kind of really merge them in interesting ways as both a writer of fiction and as a feminist. And, and then, as Jenny said, has her own unconventional relationship with Percy.
I mean, Percy Shelley was quite the character in himself. So he came from wealth and he came from privilege, but he enjoyed it, obviously, because he tried to, he spent the money when he could, and on a few occasions they lived a little rough, but mostly they didn't because of his connections. But also he was very much in favor of the reforms and the freedoms that, had come about because of the French Revolution and because of the American Revolution. And he wanted to see more of that in England. He was also very popular with the women. He had several of his own love affairs in his life, even while he and Mary were together. And again, for his short life, because he died before he turned 30, he was, and then to hang out with Lord Byron as much as they did. Yeah. And if you know anything about Byron, he was a crazy dude too. So again, his money and privilege let him do all kinds of stuff. But
just imagine being in that circle of friends.
Oh my gosh.
It would be like, how?
When I was reading about some of the dinner parties that the publisher Johnson would hold, and who was there, you just get goosebumps thinking about what those discussions would have been like and how they were talking about changing the world through their radical ideas.
It makes sense. I mean, there was the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then they were all in England. So I'm sure there were, I don't want to say an English Revolution was in their plan, but they could see how things could be changed. So it's wow.
I think it was, Jenny. I mean, that was the fear of the government. It was, certainly the fear of George III's government. There would be a similar political uprising,
Yeah.
in London and, the kind of, because remember, England and France they're separated by 12 miles of water. And
Yep.
so it's not that far away.
Right.
And so, the other thing to consider is that Mary was born under under the shadow of the French Revolution, but also of the Napoleonic Wars. And so
Yeah.
England declares war on France in 1793, and they're at war for 22 years. So
Yeah.
it's almost
Yeah.
almost up until the time when Mary Shelley publishes, well, she almost conceives of Frankenstein. So the war ends officially for the second time in 1815. She's whole life, she's under this
Yeah.
kind of threat of war. And her father really was a kind of, he really did believe in the kind of progressive march of human society. He did believe that it would get better and that we would see less inequality, and I think, sadly he didn't live to see the kind of fruits of a lot of his intellectual labor. But when he publishes in 1793, it's this long philosophical work called An Enquiry on Political Justice. And it was, it hit it was like a lightning storm when that hit. It was such a remarkable work where he's arguing for women, to have a kind of education. It's why, he and sort of Mary Wollstonecraft, who really argues that women should be educated alongside men. Strange concept, but there you are.
Right. And the
Right? Oh
same
my
type of
God.
education, not just
Yes.
that was the big thing is for Mary Wollstonecraft. She was like, we have to go beyond making purses and
Mhm.
embroidery work and all the things that were feminine.
Domestic. Yeah.
And let them learn Latin and let them learn Greek and let them, do all these things and have the same intellectual abilities as the men, which, that, like you said, that was this crazy concept that men and women could think the same thoughts.
But obviously, right, and this has a massive influence on their daughter, right, who sort of inherits all of these ideas and then in a way inherits those legacies, and also the fiction writer, right, like her parents, who infuse their novels with their philosophical ideas about equality and feminism, right, and kind of breaking down these institutions. And so it is interesting that sort of Godwin wouldn't be more, and initially he did embrace Percy Shelley because he was this radical philosopher. Shelley was sent down from Oxford, right? Because he had written this tract about atheism. And so they were like, get out of here, man. He was also, a vegetarian, which was unusual. And that makes its way into the novel, right? Because the creature is a vegetarian. He doesn't eat meat. So yeah, it's just it had to be a remarkable time to
Yeah.
be there. Wordsworth
Exciting.
writes in the beginning of his long autobiographical poem, The Prelude, he writes, "'Tis bliss then to be alive." He was just so excited. Anything seemed possible, right? And then we get the terror in France, and then it kind of got rough, but it was an exciting time.
It was interesting to read about the terror in France through Mary Wollstonecraft's eyes, because she saw a lot of the beginning of that after the end of the official revolution. She saw a lot of how things went from being really revolutionary to turning out, and so many of her own friends got executed and things. And she was seeing, the effects of the guillotine, which was, the new weapon or the new choice of dealing with the people at the time. And to read that through her thoughts was interesting, because I personally haven't done a lot of study on the French Revolution. I knew, it took place after our own revolution in America. And there were, we had obviously like Lafayette and stuff had influences on both. And we have all of that here, but I never really gave it as much thought other than,
It just happened.
then it was part of history. And of course we have Les Miserables, which I absolutely love that musical and things like that. But I never gave it much thought of what happened after that, because there was, when you look at like the American Revolution and the unrest that we had and all the political things we dealt with once our own revolution was over and we were trying to really form our country, versus what France went through, which was so much different. But I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were really trying to get rid of the aristocracy and the royalty, and it got really scary there for a while. But to be able to read some of Mary Wollstonecraft's thoughts on what was going on at the time, and the fact that she was in France for a good chunk of that was really, it brings it home in a different level that you don't think about when you read it just through like the history book.
It's more personal.
She was engaged in those debates. I mean, it was mostly a sort of, like a boys' club arguing about the sort of nature of different forms of government and rights, and Wollstonecraft weighed in and without any fear. In fact, she's the author not of one vindication, but of two. Her first one, the Vindications of the Rights of Men, which comes out in 1791, and it's a response to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is the Irish MP who is a member of Parliament. He becomes he's a supporter of the American Revolution, and in the 70s and the 80s. But when he sort of in the 1790s, he looks across. Sorry, after 1789, he's not as enthusiastic about what the French are doing, and so in 1790 he writes this long treatise called Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he makes these wild predictions about how the revolution is going to really turn violent and bloody. And everyone thinks he's nuts. They think he's crazy because it hasn't really turned violent yet. And Mary Wollstonecraft, she responds to that piece, and that reflection sells. It's one of the best-selling works of the period. That and Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. And Wollstonecraft responds to him. I mean, it's a remarkable thing for anyone to do, but for a woman, especially a young woman, to do it. And if you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It is one of the most stunning rhetorical takedowns that you will ever see. She destroys Burke. I mean, she absolutely eviscerates him. It is delightful to watch her do it. She takes him apart piece by piece. But then when her second Vindications is then published in 92, it really does eclipse that first one. No one was really reading that as much because there were so many responses to it. She weighs in. I mean, she is not shy at all. And I think Mary Shelley really does inherit her mother's impetus to do that, to be outspoken and have a voice. It's really just a remarkable thing.
We are going to pause our conversation with Jared here for this week, and we will return with him next week with the conclusion of our conversation about Mary Shelley and her life, and of course, all about how Frankenstein came to be. We thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next week.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at OrdExtraCem. So OrdExtraCem. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Diane and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.